Hello everybody, my name is Sven Hugdahl, and today I'd like to speak to you about a chapter in a book by Eran Shalev. It's called The Jewish Cincinnatus, Biblical Republicanism in the Age of the American Revolution. What Shalev points out is that the Old Testament had a large influence on the culture leading up to the American Revolution. It became part of the rallying cry. What preachers and revolutionaries would use was Old Testament stories and try to connect those stories to the cause against the British. What's familiar to many historians of the American Revolutionary period is the connection between biblical Christianity and civic republicanism. There were some themes during this period of history. One of the themes was essentially corruption versus virtue. A corrupt people could not handle having a republic. They would lose a republic. Whereas a virtuous people could live in a republic and keep that republic. One of the stories of the Old Testament that Shalev brings up is the story of the Exodus, where Moses leads Israel out of captivity. And what American revolutionaries tried to do was kind of connect the two events. They tried to say, all right, we're slaves in a sense under the British system, and what we need to do is get out of this captivity. Once Israel was set free from Egypt, they could now establish a new form of government. And what some of the preachers were saying back then and some of the leaders were saying is that somehow Israel had this republican form of government, which they eventually lost when they asked Moses to give them a king. Because people had this familiarity with the Bible, these stories were useful in rallying people to the cause. Whereas the civic humanists kind of used the old examples of Rome falling in the past through corruption. Those who connected the Bible to the American Revolution could use biblical stories that people were more familiar with. Another Old Testament story that was used was the story found in the book of Esther, where they talk about Haman. Haman was kind of like a prime minister to the king at the time. And so what people were doing is they were trying to connect Haman to some of these ministers who were there in America, used to enforce the British Stamp Act and things like that. Haman was sort of a parallel to Lord Bute and Lord North of the British, who had a lust for power, according to the revolutionaries. Mordecai, on the other hand, in the Old Testament story in Esther, would be the patriotic hero. He was the one who did not bow down to the king. What a lot of these revolutionaries were doing, in a sense, is they were stretching the biblical text to the max. They were using stories such as Deborah in the book of Judges. The prophet Deborah ends up cursing one group of individuals that did not decide to help the Israelite cause against Canaan. And that group was called Meroz. And this curse of Meroz became one of the favorite stories that Calvinist preachers would use especially. And Shalev writes that Meroz's betrayal and subsequent revilement it received in civic humanist colors reveals a Republican exegetical mode through which Americans read and applied the Republican Bible to their revolutionary needs. So this language of revolutionary republicanism surrounded ideas like being an active citizen, participating in the cause. And if you were just neutral or you were not participating, you could be considered a loyalist. You would be considered one of those in society who are corrupting, who were hungering for power. And so the virtuous Republicans could be connected to the virtuous Israelites like Deborah, like Moses leading. What Shalev does that's unique is he connects the Old Testament to the American Revolutionary cause, and he brings out some really interesting points. He gives other examples such as Gideon and other stories from the Old Testament that were used to rally revolutionaries. But essentially, Shalev kind of gets into territory that other scholars haven't, and I find what he wrote pretty interesting.